Chapter 1. The Uninvited Guest. The governor's mansion in Nassau blazed with light as the Caribbean's most prestigious social event of the season reached its peak. Lord Harrison's annual masquerade ball attracted nobility from across the British colonies, their elaborate costumes and glittering jewels reflecting the wealth and power that ruled these tropical waters. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors where aristocrats waltzed to the refined melodies of a string quartet imported from London. Among the peacocks and powdered wigs, one figure stood out like a wolf among sheep. The man wore a simple black domino mask and a captain's coat of deep burgundy, his dark hair tied back in a queue that spoke more of ship's rigging than ballroom fashion. His presence radiated danger and barely contained wildness that made the refined ladies whisper behind their fans, while their husbands fingered the ceremonial swords at their sides. Captain Rodrigo Valdez had not been invited to this gathering. In fact, his presence represented everything these people feared and despised, a pirate who had dared to walk into their sanctuary of civilization and privilege. But none of them knew the truth that burned like a secret fire in his chest. Beneath the pirate's disguise stood Alessandro Ricardo Valdez de Santangel, heir to one of Spain's greatest shipping fortunes, and owner of half the legitimate trade routes these same nobles depended upon for their wealth. "My word," whispered Lady Margaret Pemberton, her voice dripping with disdain as she observed Rodrigo from across the ballroom. "Who allowed that ruffian into decent society? He reeks of sea spray and gunpowder." Her companion, the pompous Lord Blackwood, adjusted his jeweled mask with theatrical disgust. "Pirates have grown quite bold these days, haven't they? Someone should call the governor's guard before this criminal contaminates our gathering with his presence." Rodrigo heard every word, his jaw clenching beneath his mask as familiar rage simmered in his chest. These were the same people who had destroyed his family, who had conspired to frame his father for smuggling and driven the Santangel name into exile. They had stolen his birthright through lies and corruption, forcing him to assume the identity of a pirate to survive in a world that no longer recognized his noble heritage. "Careful, my lords and ladies," he said, his cultured Spanish accent cutting through their whispered insults like a blade through silk. "Pirates have excellent hearing. We also have rather long memories for slights against our honor." The surrounding nobles recoiled as if he'd drawn a cutlass, but one figure stepped forward instead of retreating. Lady Victoria Ashford moved with the grace of someone who feared nothing, her emerald silk gown rustling as she positioned herself between Rodrigo and the scandalized aristocrats. "Captain," she said with perfect composure, her violet eyes meeting his through their respective masks. "How refreshing to meet someone who speaks their mind so directly. These gatherings tend toward tedious politeness." Rodrigo found himself studying this unexpected ally with growing fascination. Lady Victoria was renowned throughout the colonies for her beauty and intelligence, but also for her sharp tongue and refusal to marry any of her numerous suitors. She was everything these other women were not: genuine, fearless, and apparently immune to social intimidation. "Lady Ashford," he replied, with a bow that somehow managed to be both respectful and mocking. "Your reputation for courage precedes you, though I must warn you that associating with pirates tends to damage one's social standing." "Does it?" Victoria's smile was brilliant and dangerous. "How fortunate that I care nothing for the opinions of cowards who whisper behind masks while brave men face storms at sea." The insult hit its target perfectly. Lord Blackwood's face flushed red above his golden mask. "Lady Victoria, surely you don't mean to defend this criminal?" "I mean to defend courtesy, Lord Blackwood. This gentleman has done nothing but attend a public gathering, yet you treat him as if he'd stolen the crown jewels." Victoria's voice carried a steel edge that made even the most arrogant nobles step back. "Perhaps the real crime is the lack of manners displayed by those who claim superiority through accident of birth." Rodrigo felt something shift in his chest as he watched this remarkable woman defend him, without knowing anything about his true identity or circumstances. When was the last time someone had stood up for him without expecting payment or reward? "You're very kind, my lady," he said quietly. "But perhaps your friends are right to be cautious. Pirates are dangerous creatures after all." "Dangerous to whom?" Victoria challenged. "To corrupt merchants who cheat their customers? To slave traders who profit from human misery? To officials who accept bribes to ignore injustice?" Her eyes never left his as she spoke. "Such people should indeed fear honest pirates." The crowd around them grew larger as word spread. that Lady Victoria Ashford was openly conversing with a known pirate. Some watched in horror, others in fascination, but all seemed transfixed by the spectacle of propriety being challenged so directly. "Lady Victoria," Governor Harrison himself approached, his expression diplomatically neutral, but his tension obvious. "Perhaps you would honor me with a dance? The evening's entertainment is about to begin." It was clearly an attempt to separate her from Rodrigo, but Victoria declined with gracious firmness. "Thank you, Governor, but I'm quite enjoying my current conversation. Captain Valdez was just telling me about the fascinating economics of maritime trade." Rodrigo hadn't been discussing economics at all, but he recognized the lifeline she was throwing him. "Indeed, I find that honest commerce requires honest partners, something increasingly rare in these waters." "How fascinating," Victoria replied, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I'd love to hear more about your business ventures. Perhaps you'd join me on the terrace. The evening air is quite pleasant." As they walked toward the mansion's elaborate gardens, Rodrigo realized he was entering uncharted waters, more treacherous than any storm he'd weathered as a pirate. This woman saw through masks, literal and figurative, with unnerving accuracy. If he wasn't careful, she might discover that the dangerous pirate she was defending was actually the dispossessed heir to a fortune that dwarfed most of the wealth displayed in this very ballroom. But for the first time in 5 years of exile and revenge, Rodrigo found himself wanting to be discovered. Lady Victoria Ashford made him remember what it felt like to be Alessandro, to be a man worthy of respect rather than fear. The question was whether that man still existed beneath the pirate's mask, or whether 5 years of anger and isolation had killed him as thoroughly as his enemies had intended. Chapter 2. Secrets in the Garden. The governor's gardens stretched beyond the mansion like a paradise of tropical blooms and moonlit fountains, providing a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the ballroom. Victoria led Rodrigo along winding paths bordered by flowering jasmine, her emerald gown catching starlight as they moved deeper into the secluded sanctuary. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Lady Ashford," Rodrigo observed, his voice carrying both admiration and warning. "Walking alone with a pirate tends to damage more than one's reputation." "Perhaps I'm both," Victoria replied, settling gracefully on a marble bench beside a fountain, whose gentle splash masked their conversation from potential eavesdroppers. "Or perhaps I simply recognize that appearances can be deceiving." Rodrigo remained standing, his hand resting instinctively near where his cutlass would normally hang. Even in this peaceful setting, years of danger had taught him never to completely relax his guard. "What makes you so certain of your judgment? For all you know, I could be exactly what those nobles believe, a ruthless criminal who kills for pleasure and steals for sport." Victoria studied him with those penetrating violet eyes, her gaze taking in details that others missed. "Your hands," she said simply. "What about them?" "They're not the hands of a common pirate. No calluses from rope work, no scars from cutlass fights. Your skin is too soft, your nails too clean." Victoria's smile was knowing. "Either you're the most pampered pirate in the Caribbean, or you're something else entirely." Rodrigo cursed inwardly. 5 years of careful disguise, and this woman had seen through his deception in minutes. "Perhaps I'm simply a successful pirate who can afford comfort. Perhaps you're a gentleman playing at being a pirate for reasons I can't yet fathom." Victoria patted the bench beside her. "Sit, Captain Valdez. I promise not to ravage your virtue." Despite the dangerous situation, Rodrigo found himself smiling, the first genuine expression of humor he'd felt in months. He settled beside her, maintaining careful distance while remaining acutely aware of her presence. "You intrigue me, Lady Ashford. Most women of your station would have fainted at the mere sight of a pirate, yet you defend me to your peers, and now interrogate me in private." "Most women of my station are boring," Victoria replied with refreshing honesty. "They spend their lives choosing between different shades of insipidity, marrying for convenience, and pretending that propriety matters more than passion. And you're different. I'm cursed with intelligence and independence in a world that values neither quality in women." Victoria's voice carried a trace of bitterness. "I'm expected to marry Lord Blackwood or someone equally tedious, produce heirs, and fade gracefully into insignificance. The prospect holds all the appeal of a slow death." Rodrigo studied her profile in the moonlight, seeing not just beauty but strength and determination that reminded him painfully of his own mother. "So you rebel by consorting with pirates?" "I rebel by thinking for myself. Tonight that means questioning why a man who speaks like a scholar and moves like a dancer, claims to be a bloodthirsty brigand. The conversation was interrupted by approaching voices, multiple footsteps on the garden path, accompanied by the distinctive sound of steel being drawn from scabbards. Rodrigo instantly tensed, his body coiling like a spring as familiar danger instincts took control. "Lady Victoria!" Lord Blackwood's voice carried across the garden, pompous with assumed authority. "Step away from that criminal. Governor Harrison has issued orders for his arrest." 6 men emerged from the shadows, Blackwood himself accompanied by 5 of the governor's guards, their uniforms crisp and their swords gleaming in the moonlight. They formed a rough semicircle, clearly intending to prevent escape, while maintaining the pretense of civility. "Lord Blackwood," Victoria rose with regal composure, "what is the meaning of this interruption?" "The meaning, my dear, is that you're in mortal danger," Blackwood replied, his voice oozing false concern. "Captain Valdez is wanted for piracy, murder, and theft throughout the Caribbean. He's obviously lured you here for nefarious purposes." Rodrigo remained seated, his apparent calm masking the tactical assessment racing through his mind. 6 armed men in an enclosed space, Victoria as a potential hostage, limited escape routes. The odds were poor, but not impossible. "I see," Victoria said coolly. "And what evidence supports these charges?" "Evidence?" Blackwood sputtered. "He's a known pirate. His very presence here is proof enough." "How convenient," Victoria observed. "Guilt by reputation rather than deed. How very efficient." One of the guards stepped forward, his sword pointed at Rodrigo's chest. "Captain Valdez, you're under arrest by order of Governor Harrison. Surrender peacefully, and no harm will come to the lady." Rodrigo finally stood, his movements fluid and controlled, despite the weapons trained on him. "Gentlemen, I fear there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Blackwood declared. "You're a pirate, and pirates hang." "Actually," Rodrigo said, his voice taking on a different quality, more refined, more authoritative, "I'm not a pirate at all." Before anyone could react, he reached into his coat and withdrew not a weapon, but an ornate document bearing official seals. "I am Alessandro Ricardo Valdez de Santangel, Special Envoy of His Catholic Majesty King Philip of Spain, investigating reports of corruption and illegal trading practices in these colonies." The revelation hit the assembled group like a thunderbolt. Blackwood's face went pale while the guards exchanged uncertain glances. Victoria's eyes widened with understanding and something that might have been admiration. "Impossible," Blackwood whispered. "The Santangel family was destroyed years ago." "Exiled," Rodrigo corrected, his Spanish accent now pronounced and aristocratic. "There's a significant difference. My family's shipping empire spans 3 continents, and His Majesty takes a dim view of corruption that interferes with legitimate trade." He handed the document to the lead guard, who examined it with growing alarm. The seals were genuine, the signatures authentic. This was no mere pirate. This was Spanish nobility with the backing of a major European power. "The pirate identity was necessary cover," Rodrigo continued, his eyes never leaving Blackwood's terrified face. "Amazing how much more honest people become when they believe they're dealing with a harmless criminal rather than an official investigator." Victoria stepped closer to him, her violet eyes bright with newfound understanding. "Alessandro," she said, testing the name. "It suits you better than Rodrigo. You may call me whatever you prefer, Lady Ashford, though I fear this revelation rather ruins the romantic danger of consorting with pirates." "Does it?" Victoria's smile was radiant. "I find that consorting with mysterious Spanish nobles investigating corruption holds its own appeal." Blackwood, realizing the catastrophic implications of his situation, began backing toward the garden entrance. This changes nothing. You have no authority here." "Don't I?" Alessandro pulled out a second document, a letter of marque from Governor Harrison himself, authorizing my investigation. It seems he's quite concerned about irregularities in colonial shipping records. As Blackwood fled into the night, no doubt to burn incriminating documents and prepare alibis, Alessandro turned to Victoria with a rueful smile. "I apologize for the deception, Lady Ashford, but as you can see, sometimes the most effective mask is the truth worn inside out." "I understand completely," Victoria replied. "After all, I've been wearing my own mask tonight." "What do you mean?" Victoria's smile was mysteriously enchanting. "I mean that Lady Victoria Ashford died 3 years ago in a carriage accident. What stands before you is someone else entirely, someone with her own reasons for investigating corruption in these colonies." As the implications of her words sank in, Alessandro realized that the evening's revelations were far from over. Chapter 3. The Lady's Secret. The revelation hung between them like a sword suspended by silk thread. Alessandro studied Victoria's face in the moonlight, searching for signs of deception, but finding only steady resolve in her violet eyes. Around them, the governor's guards maintained respectful distance, while they grappled with the implications of having arrested a Spanish noble at a diplomatic gathering. Lady Victoria Ashford died in a carriage accident, Alessandro repeated slowly. Yet here you stand, very much alive and bearing her name. Either Spanish intelligence reports are severely lacking, or you're about to tell me something that will complicate an already complex evening. Victoria's laugh was musical, but tinged with sadness. Your intelligence reports were accurate, Don Alessandro. Victoria Ashford did die that night, along with her parents and younger brother when their carriage plunged off a cliff during a storm. What survived was her distant cousin, Catherine Hartwell, who bore a striking resemblance to the deceased heiress. And Catherine Hartwell became Victoria Ashford because Catherine Hartwell was the bastard daughter of a serving girl and a nobleman who refused to acknowledge her existence. Because the real Victoria was my dearest friend, and in her final moments, she begged me to use her identity to accomplish what she could not. Alessandro found himself leaning closer, drawn by the pain and determination in her voice. Which was? Bringing down the conspiracy that murdered her family. Victoria's voice hardened with resolve. The carriage accident was no accident, Don Alessandro. It was carefully orchestrated by men who wanted the Ashford shipping contracts and were willing to commit murder to obtain them. The pieces began falling into place in Alessandro's mind. Lord Blackwood, among others. A syndicate of corrupt nobles who've been systematically eliminating competition and manipulating colonial trade for their own profit. The same men who framed your father and drove your family into exile. Alessandro felt his world tilt as the implications hit him. You know about my father? I know that Don Carlos Valdez de Santangel was the most honest shipping merchant in the Caribbean, until false evidence of smuggling destroyed his reputation. I know that the evidence was fabricated by the same men who killed Victoria's family, and I know that his son disappeared the night before he was to be arrested, supposedly lost at sea. You've been investigating this for 3 years? Just as you've been investigating it for 5, though your methods have been more direct. Victoria smiled at his expression. Did you think you were the only one seeking justice? The mysterious pirate captain who somehow always knew which ships carried illegal cargo? Which officials could be bribed? Which merchants were cutting deals with slavers? Alessandro stared at her with growing amazement. You've been feeding me information. Anonymous tips delivered through various intermediaries, yes. Though I must say, your reputation for vengeance made certain sources quite eager to cooperate. Victoria's expression grew serious. But tonight changes everything. If you're here officially as a Spanish envoy, then we can end this conspiracy legally instead of through piracy. Alessandro understood immediately. Your evidence combined with mine, presented through official diplomatic channels. Exactly. Though there's one complication, which is? Victoria was quiet for a moment, then met his eyes directly. I'm in love with you. The simple statement hit Alessandro like a cannonball to the chest. What? I've been in love with you for 2 years. Ever since I first realized that the mysterious Captain Valdez was actually the noble heir I'd been researching. Watching you seek justice for your father while protecting innocent merchants. Seeing you choose honor over easy profit. How could I not fall in love with such a man? Alessandro's world seemed to spin around him. This remarkable woman had been his anonymous ally, his secret source of intelligence, his guide through the maze of colonial corruption, and she'd been in love with him throughout their strange partnership. Victoria, Catherine, whoever you are, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I don't even know your real name. My real name is Catherine Hartwell. But my real identity is the woman who spent 3 years dreaming of the day when we could work together openly instead of through shadows and intermediaries. Before Alessandro could respond, urgent voices erupted from the direction of the mansion. Shouts of, "Fire!" echoed across the gardens, while orange light began flickering through the windows of the governor's residence. Blackwood, Alessandro cursed, understanding immediately. He's destroying evidence. They ran toward the mansion together, but the damage was already extensive. The governor's private office, where colonial trade records were kept, was engulfed in flames that were obviously no accident. Guards and guests formed bucket brigades, while the fire consumed decades of documentation. All the official records, Victoria said grimly as they watched the inferno. Birth certificates, shipping manifests, trade agreements, everything that could prove the conspiracy. Not everything, Alessandro replied, pulling her closer as sparks drifted around them like deadly snow. I have copies of the most crucial documents aboard my ship. And you? Hidden in a dozen different locations throughout the colonies. Blackwood may have destroyed the originals, but we have enough evidence to hang him and his associates. Governor Harrison appeared beside them, his face streaked with soot and his expression grim. Don Alessandro, Lady Victoria, thank God you're safe. This is a disaster. Irreplaceable colonial records lost to what appears to be arson. Governor, Alessandro said carefully, perhaps this tragedy presents an opportunity. If you're willing to cooperate with an official Spanish investigation, we might be able to reconstruct those records while identifying who had motive to destroy them. Harrison's eyes sharpened with understanding. You're suggesting this fire was connected to corruption in the colonial administration? I'm suggesting that honest officials have nothing to fear from Spanish-British cooperation in fighting corruption. Dishonest officials, however, might take desperate measures to avoid exposure. As they spoke, a new commotion arose from the harbor direction. Ship's bells were ringing alarm signals, while signal rockets painted the night sky with urgent warnings. What now? Harrison muttered. A messenger arrived on horseback, his uniform marking him as British Naval Intelligence. Governor, urgent dispatch from Admiral Worthington. A Spanish fleet has been spotted approaching Nassau. Warships flying diplomatic flags but heavily armed. Alessandro smiled grimly. That would be my backup, Governor. I did mention that His Catholic Majesty takes corruption seriously. Harrison's face went pale as he realized the full implications. Spanish warships in Nassau Harbor, diplomatic immunity for their envoy, and a fire that had conveniently destroyed evidence of British colonial malfeasance. Don Alessandro, Harrison said carefully, perhaps we should discuss this matter privately? An excellent suggestion, though I should mention that Lady Victoria will be participating in all discussions, as she represents certain interests that are crucial to resolving this situation peacefully. As they walked toward the governor's undamaged guest quarters, Victoria slipped her hand into Alessandro's. So, what happens now? She asked quietly. Now, we finish what we started, Alessandro replied, squeezing her fingers gently. We bring down the conspiracy that destroyed both our families. And then? Alessandro stopped walking and turned to face her fully. And then I court you properly, Lady Catherine Hartwell, because I find myself quite desperately in love with a woman who spent 3 years fighting for justice while pretending to be someone else. Victoria's smile was radiant in the firelight. I thought you'd never ask. As Spanish warships entered Nassau Harbor and corrupt nobles fled into the night, Alessandro realized that the greatest treasure he'd found wasn't gold or vengeance. It was love with a woman brave enough to fight beside him for justice. Chapter 4. The Price of Justice. The Spanish fleet's arrival at Nassau Harbor transformed the colonial port from a place of leisure into a theater of international diplomacy. 5 warships flying the Royal Spanish colors anchored in perfect formation, while their guns remained run out. A reminder that diplomatic immunity came backed by considerable firepower. Alessandro stood on the governor's private wharf beside Victoria, both of them watching as Admiral Miguel de Santangel, his own uncle, stepped ashore with the ceremonial pomp befitting a senior Spanish naval officer. Nephew, the admiral said warmly, embracing Alessandro with genuine affection. When your letter reached Madrid, describing the scope of this conspiracy, His Majesty insisted on a proper response. These British merchants have been stealing from Spanish shipping interests for years. Uncle Miguel, Alessandro replied, may I present Lady Catherine Hartwell, who has been instrumental in gathering evidence against the conspirators. Admiral de Santangel studied Victoria with the appraising eye of a man accustomed to reading character quickly. The lady who has been feeding you intelligence for 2 years? Your letters spoke highly of her courage and resourcefulness. Your nephew is too kind, Victoria said with a graceful curtsy. Though I fear my methods have been somewhat unconventional for a lady. Unconventional times require unconventional solutions, señorita. Now, let us see exactly what we're dealing with. Governor Harrison approached their group with obvious nervousness, flanked by what remained of his senior colonial officials. Several notable absences marked the morning. Lord Blackwood had vanished during the night, along with 3 other suspected conspirators, taking what portable wealth they could carry aboard fast ships that had slipped anchor before dawn. Don Alessandro, Admiral de Santangel, Harrison said with careful diplomacy. "Perhaps we should discuss this matter in private." "Privacy is unnecessary, Governor," Alessandro replied smoothly. "Lady Catherine will be participating in all discussions, as she holds documentary evidence crucial to both Spanish and British interests." They assembled in the governor's emergency meeting room, where Victoria produced a leather portfolio that made Harrison's eyes widen with recognition. Inside were copies of shipping manifests, altered trade agreements, forged inspection reports, and correspondence between colonial officials and corrupt merchants, a paper trail that connected 5 years of systematic fraud. "This document," Victoria said, placing a particular letter on the table, "shows Lord Blackwood arranging for falsified evidence to be planted in Don Carlos de Santangel's warehouse. The payment came from a fund administered by colonial officials." Harrison's face went ashen as he recognized his own signature on the authorization. "Lady Catherine, I assure you, I had no knowledge that this fund was being used for such purposes." "We know, Governor," Alessandro said gently. "Your signature was forged. We have the original in your hand for comparison. You were as much a victim of this conspiracy as anyone else." Admiral de Santangel spread additional documents across the table, evidence gathered by Spanish intelligence, showing the full scope of the criminal enterprise. This conspiracy cost Spanish merchants over 2 million pesos in stolen cargo and fraudulent trade deals. His Majesty considers this an act of war. "War?" Harrison's voice cracked slightly. "However," the Admiral continued smoothly, "His Majesty is also interested in justice rather than conflict. If the British colonial government demonstrates good faith in prosecuting these criminals and compensating Spanish losses—" "Of course," Harrison said quickly. "Full cooperation, complete transparency. But most of the conspirators have fled." "Not all of them," Victoria interrupted, producing another set of documents. 3 of the junior conspirators remain in Nassau, believing themselves safe because they covered their tracks carefully. They didn't account for someone documenting their activities from the inside. She placed photographs on the table, images captured through careful surveillance showing colonial officials accepting bribes, altering documents, and meeting secretly with known criminals. The evidence was damning and undeniable. "My God," Harrison breathed. "How did you manage to gather all this?" "The real Victoria Ashford had been investigating suspicious activities before her death," Catherine explained. "When I assumed her identity, I continued her work with additional motivation. It took 3 years to piece together the full conspiracy." Alessandro watched with pride as Victoria, Catherine, methodically destroyed the criminal enterprise that had cost both their families so much pain. Her intelligence, courage, and dedication had made this moment possible. "There's one more matter," Admiral de Santangel said, producing an ornate document bearing royal seals. "His Catholic Majesty has instructed me to offer British colonial authorities a formal treaty of mutual trade protection. Spanish and British ships would patrol these waters jointly, preventing future criminal conspiracies while ensuring fair treatment for legitimate merchants." Harrison's relief was palpable. A formal treaty would resolve the crisis peacefully while providing Spanish backing for his colonial administration. "Admiral, such a treaty would be most welcome." "Excellent. Don Alessandro will serve as Spanish liaison for implementing these new protections." The Admiral's eyes twinkled with paternal amusement. "I trust he'll find his duties engaging." As the formal negotiations continued, Alessandro drew Catherine aside to the privacy of the governor's garden, where their strange courtship had begun the previous evening. "So it's finished," Catherine said, watching Spanish and British officials working together to draft agreements that would reshape Caribbean trade. "The conspiracy is exposed. The criminals will face justice, and our family's honor is restored." "Our family's honor, yes. But what about us?" Alessandro took her hands in his, studying her face in the morning sunlight. "Catherine Hartwell, will you marry Alessandro de Santangel? Not for political alliance or social advancement, but because 2 people who fought for justice together discovered they couldn't imagine fighting life's battles apart?" Catherine's smile was radiant. "I've been waiting 3 years for you to ask that question. Yes, Don Alessandro. Yes to marriage. Yes to partnership. Yes to whatever adventures await us." Their kiss was interrupted by applause from the terrace, where Admiral de Santangel and Governor Harrison had been watching with paternal approval. "Uncle," Alessandro called out, his arm around Catherine's waist. "I believe congratulations are in order." "Indeed they are, nephew. Lady Catherine, welcome to the Santangel family. I suspect you'll find us quite adventurous." 6 months later, the newly restored Santangel shipping empire held its inaugural celebration in the grand ballroom of their rebuilt Nassau headquarters. The guest list included reformed colonial officials, honest merchants, and several former pirates who had accepted Spanish letters of marque to patrol Caribbean waters against genuine criminals. Alessandro and Catherine stood together greeting their guests, their wedding rings catching candlelight as they moved through the crowd with easy grace. They had built something new from the ashes of their family's destruction, not just a business empire, but a partnership based on shared principles and mutual respect. "Any regrets?" Catherine asked, as they watched their guests dance to music played by the same orchestra that had performed at the governor's ball where they'd first met. "Only one," Alessandro replied, pulling her closer as the waltz began. "I regret that it took so long for us to stop hiding behind masks and start trusting each other with the truth. But we found each other eventually," Catherine said, her violet eyes bright with happiness. "Sometimes the best treasures are worth waiting for." As they danced beneath chandeliers that reflected their shared triumph over corruption and betrayal, Alessandro reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. The pirate who had been mocked by nobles had revealed himself to be a millionaire seeking justice. The lady who had defended him had proved to be a fellow seeker of truth. And together, they had discovered that the greatest victory wasn't defeating their enemies. It was finding someone worth fighting beside for the rest of their lives. The end.